Well, hello, I'm delighted to welcome you here to Château de Meauce. You're in Burgundy, in the Nièvre region, on the banks of the Allier, on the borders of Burgundy, Berry and Bourbonnais. Perhaps you'd like to come inside Château de Meauce and take a tour of the interior. We're in the courtyard here, which dates back to a chateau built around the year 1000, and the construction dates from the 12th to the 18th century. So it's an assemblage of several generations that have all left their mark on Château de Meauce in different ways. So, for example, here you have a 13th century door alongside a 15th and 17th century door. If we'd come to Château de Meauce in the 13th century, we'd have seen a courtyard twice as big. The well here would have been in the middle of the courtyard, but the small rocky spur on which Château de Meauce is situated was so small that it was necessary to build inside on the rock. And little by little the chateau and this courtyard shrank as construction progressed. We have a staircase here from the original dwelling of the Lords of Meauce, dating back to the 13th century, for example, alongside another more emblematic, more phenomenal staircase dating back to the end of the 15th century. So for us here in Meauce, when you come across a collection of old stones like this, spanning several centuries, you're bound to come across discoveries that create a kind of epidemic. It's the scratching disease. For example, this door here, you can see it, was discovered a few years ago. It was Easter weekend in 2017, and in 3 days we discovered this sculpture, this rather interesting door, and brought it up to date. But for owners who find a chateau like this and restore it, it's obviously a challenge, since the principle, the restoration approach we decided on with the Ministry of Culture, is to restore the chateau to its 18th century state. And in the 18th century, this door was of course already hidden, not visible. And we didn't initially have the authorization to make it visible, so we fought with the association and tried to convince the Ministry of Culture to educate and show how this 13th century gateway sits alongside the 15th and 17th century ones. It shows the evolution of the art of doors in the south of France and how architecture has evolved. I offer you the chance to get inside. We're going into a kitchen. We are in a fairly recent kitchen, dating back to the 16th century. We used to live in the courtyard here, but we had to convert this courtyard little by little to be able to extend the living space. So there are some interesting things here, like the floor and its paving, or this big fireplace. We haven't done any work here yet, so you can see it as it was in 2016 when we found it. I'd now like to take you back to where we've done some major renovation work. So here we are in a room known as the Justice Room. Justice Room because it was the largest room in the chateau and was in fact larger than it is today. It owns some artworks that prove the importance of this room where we were hosting people that came to visit the chateau. A number of important discoveries have been made representing a lot of concerns for someone buying a castle which was in an advanced state of peril. As I said earlier, the principle is 18th century, and when we did the archaeological studies of the Château de Meauce, we were told that there were certainly paintings all along and all around this room. And one day, when I bought a 5-meter ladder, since the joists are 5 meters high, I decided to go and see what these paintings were, even though I'd been told they were of little interest, since they must have been endlessly repeated branches. And with this big ladder, I discreetly undid the top right-hand corner and discovered and stumbled upon a livestock paw, which in no way resembled a branch. And in an hour and a half, passion winning out, I uncovered the entire wall, and we have a very fine frieze of paintings, 70 centimeters high, representing the coats of arms of the marriages of the women of Meauce. So this is an important historical discovery, since the story is told on this frieze. But what's even more important is that you'll also find a number of antique decorations in the style of the great castles, in a small castle on a plain, and most importantly for us, who are passionate about the natural environment and biodiversity of this site, you'll find a whole range of animals that live here on this site even today. So we're convinced that since the dawn of time at Meauce, nature and heritage, landscape and architecture have formed a harmonious whole, and that's what we're still defending today. The other great symbol in this room is this fireplace, a monumental fireplace that has been listed for so long, in fact listed since 1920, just for its feet, twisted and sculpted in stone. So that's something quite rare and impressive. But the mantle of this fireplace was plastered. Here, for example, you can clearly see the plaster that covered this fireplace when we bought the chateau in 2016. Then, still on the principle of restoration of the 18th century, the mantle was plastered, so we would have had to restore it in plaster. Fortunately, with the French Ministry of Culture, we were able to come to an agreement to understand each other, and we were able to restore the mantle as it was, with the lions representing the de Roffignac family, present here from 1349 to 1690. And then the little spurs, these stars, these knurls, with a little hole in the middle, which have been in the arms of the Lords of Meauce since the year 1000. And with each marriage, each de Meauce woman who passed on the castle to a new family ensured that the new family kept its spurs in the coat of arms of the new Lords of Meauce. So this is a chateau of women. It changed names many times, first with the Meauce family, then with the Monteluc family, and finally with the Roffignac family. And each time, in the absence of male descendants, the chateau was passed on to a new family by women. But the women were extraordinary here. They left their coat of arms on the wall, but they also made sure that the chateau always stayed in the same family, always marrying two sisters with two brothers from a new family, so that if there were no descendants, the younger sister would take over the chateau with her husband, who was the brother of the first sister's husband. So it's really a discovery here too, a passion for us, first the architecture, then the nature, and now the depth of the history. Every stone we move, every coat of arms we discover, every person who lived here brings us an extraordinary wealth, and their lives were very well made, very well structured, both legally and financially. Désolé. For example, these women, in order to find sources of income, naturally had a right to high, medium, and low justice. But they also sometimes used a little trickery or tricks, since the Allier River, which passes at the foot of the castle, is very important in the economy. They were having the so-called wreck right on any boat that ran aground on the sands of Meauce. And as groundings became rarer and rarer with technological progress in boat building, they put piles in the river to generate much more revenue. So both the beautiful and the not-so-beautiful history of this chateau are always interesting discoveries for us. Women today, in the modern history of Meauce, is also our choice of architect, since we have taken on a young woman, chief architect of historic monuments, who from the outset has managed all the exterior and interior work at Château de Meauce, and even the refurbishments. But I'd like to show you a few photos that will help you understand the advanced state of peril at Château de Meauce. For example, here you have everything what we're going to see next. Non-existent floors, non-existent windows, a state of neglect for almost 150 years. The chateau hasn't been lived in since 1830, since the last owner died, and the families who inherited Château de Meauce used to come here to spend pleasant times fishing, hunting, having family lunches by the water, but it was no longer a lively, inhabited place, and little by little, it fell into serious disrepair and was abandoned for over 150 years. And if I also show you some photos of the exterior, you'll understand much better the state of deterioration of Château de Meauce. It's a round chateau. Here you see the east facade of this round chateau, which was covered in ivy. Here you have the west facade of this round chateau with cinder blocks, no windows still in place, tile and slate roofs on one side and on the other, really disrepair at every level. And then you can see what for us was also something very beautiful and very romantic. That's the chateau in the vegetation. Here it's embedded in vegetation. You have to imagine when we first visited it in 2015, it took us a year to buy it, but we couldn't even see all the castle's walls, so dense was the vegetation. And for restorers, it's sometimes very difficult to leave behind a beautiful romantic ruin, only to suddenly find a monument where all that's left is disrepair, where scaffolding is nibbling away at this beautiful romantic chateau. So that's why we had to move fast. We were lucky enough to be able to carry out all the work on two fronts at the same time as the archaeological research. And so, in 5 or 6 years, we were able to move from a state of ruin, of advanced peril. Every room had its own ceiling and floor and was covered with its own framework. There was always something missing somewhere. So we went from this state of peril to the state you know today. I'm quick to admit it, but it was necessary because, as the companions say, 1 or 2 or even 3 more years would have brought the chateau down. I'd now like to suggest that we move on to the even more sophisticated part, where we live and entertain, since today's business model, or at least the start of it, is accommodation. We may talk about our expectations for the future, but at the moment we also want to be able to open up this chateau to as many people as possible. So it's open and can be fully privatized. You'll see, with our architect, we've made a choice that we are assuming and that we appreciate at the end. But 'tis a preoccupation, I think, for all of us who own a chateau, to know how to fit it out while respecting its history. So we chose to keep all traces of the perilous past on the walls, and on the contrary, to bring as much modernity as possible to the heart of these rooms, so that we could live in them comfortably. That's the principle behind the restoration of this chateau. To preserve the old kitchen we saw earlier, we created a modern kitchen in one of the salons at Château de Meauce. We did this with our architect Charlotte Hubert, who also worked on the Hunting Museum. And you'll see that the principle each time is to recreate volumes within the large volumes of the Château de Meauce. You'll see cubes, squares, and rectangles that are there to restore volume and tone to the interior of these old rooms, while keeping the walls as intact as possible. Here we're going to go into a living room we call the winter living room. In the winter room you'll see at the same time walls like these, which are very wide. In some places the walls are 3 meters thick. When we bought Château de Meauce, we knew we were going to have to spend a lot of money on carpentry, roofing and flooring, but we thought that the masonry was so thick that we wouldn't have to worry about a thing. But all the openings you see here, which are large in these medieval walls, have weakened these very thick walls. And here we have a 16th century window, but we still have the 12th century window. Here we have 14th century doors in some places. So these big walls, in fact, are like cobblestones. And I've lived through some extremely difficult and painful moments where at the start of the restoration, when the facing stones had fallen, here for example, for hours on end, the sand from 3 floors would fall here. You'd come back the next day and there'd be a huge pile of sand. It was as if a dead box spring had come overnight to deliver the interiors of Château de Meauce. So we had to inject lime grout for almost a year. For a year, we couldn't attack the framework because we had to consolidate the walls and restore their tone and also restore their strength. As a result, we've got nice walls, nice renderings, but they're, for me, steep and a bit abrupt. And so that's why we've kept, wherever possible, these old picketed walls to preserve, and this is important to us, for as long as possible, the traces of the state of ruin and peril when we first came to Meauce. For us, it was important to preserve the fragile, sensitive spirit of a castle that had been abandoned for too long. And we hope to be able, even if it may seem a little shocking to you, to have both these 15th century plasterwork here, these little edgings here, this white ochre and this little brown edging, which is from 1690. We had a study carried out on all the decorations in the chateau, and for us, it's important in each of the rooms to keep at least 2 walls which still contain these traces of Meauce's history. I'd now like to take you on a tour of the chateau's grand staircase. So here you are on one of the 3 staircases at Château de Meauce. This is the most recent. This one dates back to 1490, and it's a staircase we find extremely pleasant and even very pretty. We like it a lot, even if we didn't want to redo the plasterwork once again. But you see, there's light and the steps are simple. I think we've really got a staircase here that's much bigger and more impressive than the little round Château de Meauce deserved. I suggest you enter 2 rooms in the chateau. So here we are in one of the bedrooms of Château de Meauce on the 1st floor. These rooms were extensively refurbished in the 16th and 17th centuries. So here are some little treasures. For example, the ceiling. You have a 16th century ceiling with molded joists. Our problem here was that there were maybe, let's say, a quarter or a third of the original joists left, particularly the shorter ones. So we had to reproduce them. The question is, do we put some molded joists everywhere, or do we try to cheat a little maybe? And in fact, together with the architect and the French Ministry of Culture, we decided to use identical new joists to maintain the appearance of a 16th century floor and ceiling. We still have the entire stone cornice, also from the same period. And then there's our sensitivity to the need to preserve, for example, very simple decorations, which are certainly the decorations as they were in the chateau in the 16th century. And you see, for us, it's very important for other reasons. Here we find this blue-gray-green, and that's what really motivated us to have this color as the dominant major color throughout the chateau, whether it's the woodwork, exterior, interior, shutters, doors, in short, everything that comes in, everything we've been able to have as a decorative element whenever possible will be based on this blue-gray, like, for example, this ceiling that we did during the COVID with lime whitewash, around the blue-gray color. Then, the other point of interest here is this mullioned window, with its cushions already in a fairly wide embrasure. So for us, it's of great interest. But you have to imagine, when you buy Château de Meauce, you don't see this embrasure and this mullioned window. Here, it's clogged on the inside, it's clogged on the outside. And when you remove the vegetation, you find a huge crack in this wall. And that's when you think, that's it, another big budget overrun on the masonry. And as soon as the scaffolding was in place, we went to open the crack, and there we found a little treasure, this mullion that had been broken, that had fallen in 3 pieces inside, where there was rubble filling the window embrasure. And once again, we had to fight, argue, and convince the Ministry of Culture, and fortunately they agreed, despite the principle of 18th century restoration, that we could put back the mullion. The cushion, the handcuff, and this window, which of course brings the western sunshine into this room, and above all reminds us of the different periods of life between here, the 13th, and then the 16th with the ceiling, and the 17th with these large windows, because for us, the interest of Meauce is of course its history, but as I said, also the landscapes, the nature, the water, the river, the birds that bathe at the foot of the Château de Meauce. And then always our sensitivity on the walls. You see on the walls some graffitis and also some writings. For example, when we removed all the previous plaster right up to the 16th century, we found writing from 1596. Here, the Cardinal de Malsec, that was his bedroom, so we found some of his writings, or people who wrote for him, or even the previous owners, the Roffignacs, whose names are written all over the walls of Meauce. And then, in any case, for me personally, a very great sensitivity to see the effort that was made in the 16th or 17th century to reproduce the rendering and stone joints on these renderings. I'd also like to suggest that we take a moment to consider one of the problematic that was ours in any case. I am talking about the beds in the rooms, in rooms like here that are not big but still have a big volume. So putting a bed like that in the middle of a room would have been lost, and we didn't want to have beds with volume like four-poster beds to recreate volume in these large rooms. So we really wanted to keep the beds as modern as possible, but we also had the problem of positioning them so that they had a place of their own. And that's why we created these platforms, the aim of which actually is to recreate a volume in very large rooms so that the beds on them don't just float in the middle of the room, but are well positioned on a platform and thus find a perfectly correct, balanced place in the life of this chateau. Still on the subject of volumes, let's move on to another room where I'd like to show you a bathroom and toilet positioned in the middle of a room. Originally, we weren't allowed to create a bathroom there. It was extremely complicated because the DRAC, the French Ministry of Culture, didn't want us to cut this room in 2 or 3 and asked us to make sure that the joists, which are one of the treasures of this floor, could be seen from everywhere and that the volume of this room could be understood from everywhere. So we decided to create a block, bathroom on one side, toilet on the other, in the middle of this room so that it could fully exist, and then put a bed back on its platform. I'd now like to take you back up the stairs to reach one of the treasures in Meauce. I'm talking about the iron rafter frame. Here we are in frameworks of Meauce, a part of the framework. So here are the slate-covered slopes, which were restored 2 years ago, about half new wood, half old wood. And for us, it's really our little Meauce forest. There's the big Notre Dame forest. We too have our little forest. And when we bought it in 2016, we were really devastated in any case. We had a big problem, which was that 2 months after the purchase, colossal archaeological research was imposed on us. 120,000 euros worth of archaeological prescriptions from the regional archaeology department, ranging from the study of all the stones, the building, the history of the building, to, of course, excavations and the dating of the wood, which we'll come back to. And for us, this was not at all included in our financing plan, so this time it was a very, very heavy slate to carry, to manage and accept. So we fought and argued, and what's more, we didn't want to delay the work. Fortunately, the DRAC agreed to support us in these studies and to launch the work at the same time as the study. And it's a treasure. I say to everyone, if you can do these studies, it's better to do them because they've given us a ton of vital information and a better understanding of the chateau in which we live and which we're showing today. Here, for example, we did some dendrochronology and were able to date this framework. It dates back to 1380, the date on which the trees and chains that make up the structure were cut. And that's important because once we have the cutting date, we can relate it to the history of the people who lived here. And it was a young man who, in 1380, decided to improve his castle. He was very young, the son of the nephew of Pope Innocensis. A lot of money was coming into the family. His mother gave him the castle, so he wanted to impress his guests. So he creates this great frame. He transformed the small 12th century roof structure covered with tiles into a very modern structure covered with slate, which was quite unique in Burgundy at the time. And he'll install these punches here, for example, which are carved like stone. They're really carved like stone. Even the punch, the faces are very regular, they're well sculpted. And he wants to represent here on the punch and on the entrance really a stone sculpture, which must have been very, very expensive at the time. Historical and archaeological studies, when compared with texts, reveal that this young man disappeared as early as 1382. And his mother took back her castle. She took back the castle of Meauce. And we have texts where she sells wood. And so today we consider that if the young man hadn't disappeared, the mother would never have recovered her chateau, and we'd probably have a round Château de Meauce, entirely with a high frame and entirely covered with slates. So you see, this little story just goes to show how all these studies, which are costly and a real hassle for owners sometimes, are also treasures. And since Meauce wasn't inhabited or transformed in any way in the 19th and 20th centuries, it was easy to trace all this history. To come back to this frame, if it's as beautiful as it is, if it's as sculpted as it is, it wasn't meant to be an attic, it was meant to be seen, and so there was no floor in this room. Here, if we were in the 14th century, we'd fall straight into the room below, a large reception room, because it was meant to be seen. But it must have been very uncomfortable, and so very quickly, we consider in any case that as soon as the Grand Escalier was built in 1490, this framework probably only had a century of visibility of the rooms below, and very quickly, it became an attic. And Meauce's good fortune is that they didn't succeed in their transformation into an agricultural economy, and unlike other chateaux, we never needed to use these granaries, so we didn't need to make room, we didn't need to knock down these punches and entrances, and so we're lucky enough to have kept the frame intact, just as it was in 2016, just as it was in the 18th century, with the rafters forming a truss with its punches and entrances, and as an added rarity, it rotates. Since the chateau is round, that's its particularity, and, well, here we have a frame that rotates regularly all around the chateau. So, just now, we were under the framework, the slate framework, which you can see behind us, and now we're on a scaffolding that wants to restore the Meauce dovecote, because the future is still and always work where you never stop, that's life, and we're very happy to be able to continue this restoration. But I'd now like to turn my attention to the roof of Château de Meauce. We've seen the inside of the framework, but look at this round chateau. It has two roofs, one in slate, the other in tile. It's always intriguing. And for us, it was a very big difficulty because the framework that today receives the slates, on one side, there was sheet metal, on the other side, there was tile, and on the other side, there was slate. Three elements, so the sheet metal was quickly eliminated, but which element covered the Meauce framework? Fortunately, the archaeologists, and once again this historical study, enabled us to find in the small tomettes that covered the floor of the rooms, and this 15th century tomette, we discovered quite a few fragments of slate, so that's the first trace. Secondly, we discovered a flat-bottomed boat that sank at the foot of the Charité Bridge piers, covered in slate, and this boat was from the 14th century. Perhaps was he sailing up the Loire to deliver a cargo of slate here in Meauce? In any case, slate went up the Loire and up the Allier and could cover a riverside chateau like this one. So that's why you see slate on the 14th century frame. On the other hand, the lower frame, which is covered with tiles, still has its 12th century shape and 12th century roofing, which has continued to this day. This round castle, which you can see here, a particularity of Meauce, still has its integral parapet walk. The parapet walk goes all the way around this round castle, and its roundness is linked to two things. It was a form of defense in the year 1000, when the first castle walls were erected, and on a small castle like this, it acted as a keep. It's a shepkels that we sometimes find in England, and quite often even in England at that time, because it allowed us to defend it better, to save space, and to be very efficient with a sentry walk that you could quickly walk around. Today we're trying to restore as much of this walkway as possible. Since 2016, we've been lucky enough to experience some great days, some very human milestones, with the creation of an association, 400 members today, and 100 volunteers who have come to help us, particularly on the outside, to clear the castle. Some of these companions have been with us since the 2016 season and have never left the site. They became now part of my family who, today, is very involved with Château de Meauce. And so we wanted to carry on. We've received so much help, donations too, and there have been several participative financing operations where people who weren't able to come and work with their hands or support this association abroad have also helped us financially. And so we also wanted to give an even more social, even more collective character to this restoration. That's why this dovecote, for example, which we're going to restore to its original state as a farming tool to revive the agricultural aspect of Meauce, has been entrusted to a heritage integration association called Tremplin Home et Patrimoine. Today, 10 people are rebuilding the dovecote, and they're also rebuilding themselves by rebuilding a beautiful work of art. So, for us, it's very important. It takes longer, it's probably a bit more expensive too, but having this side to it is also to leave us with a very important aspect of the Château de Meauce. And then there's the so-called mansard barn, which has a floor surface area of 280 square meters over 3 levels, and was in a state of peril. I thought it could last 10 years, but it was so jealous of the chateau's restoration that it did everything it could to fall into disrepair sooner than expected. And so we're very happy to have been supported by the France Relance plan, linked to COVID, which has enabled us to launch a new phase of work sooner than expected, and that's kind of our difficulty now. Once all this is finished, how do we manage to keep this very human aspect, very open to others, very protective of nature and biodiversity, on a listed natural site of the Bec d'Allier, while at the same time having an economic model that works, since we are aware that the Château de Meauce will have to live without us one day, and will have to be able to maintain itself, in quotation marks, as much as possible. And so, it's important to find the economic model. I thought it would be easier for me to find a business model than to restore. In reality, the restoration work is progressing, but we haven't yet found the best balance between a high but not too intense level of visitor numbers, between significant income for the chateau that will enable it to live, and respect for its integrity. So we're looking for exchanges, best practices, even ideas, so that we can turn this site into something that can practically live on its own and not need us all the time, as we've done over the last few years. So let's hear your good ideas, and we'll be delighted to discuss them with you. So much for the future of Meauce.